Imagine being 12 years old, your hands trembling in a dress far too heavy for your small frame. You're standing outside a stone church you've never entered before. A man twice your age is beside you, staring at you like you're a cow he just purchased. You don't know his name. You don't understand the vows. But everyone around you expects one word from you. Yes. This is not the beginning of a love story. This is the beginning of your sentence. In medieval Europe, marriage was not a celebration of love. It was a transaction. A carefully calculated deal made between families to secure land, labor, alliances, and survival. Personal feelings were not part of the equation. In fact, they were considered irrelevant, even dangerous. A marriage based on love was rare and viewed with suspicion. The very idea that someone, especially a woman, could choose her partner was a radical and often laughable notion. To truly understand just how little freedom individuals had in matters of marriage, we have to step into their world. A world where your future was sealed with a handshake before you could even say your own name clearly. A world where your parents chose your spouse the way they chose a good pair of oxen. Strong, durable, and useful. For noble families, marriages were not just useful, they were strategic. Think of them like chess pieces on a board. A daughter wasn't a beloved child in this context. She was a means to expand the family's influence. If a marriage could bring more land or an alliance with a more powerful house, then it was arranged without hesitation. Age didn't matter. Compatibility didn't matter. What mattered was what could be gained. Even among peasants, people with no titles, no estates, and no royal connections, marriage followed a similar pattern. A peasant family might offer their daughter to a neighbor in exchange for shared use of farmland, or to settle a dispute, or to gain protection in hard times. Love had nothing to do with it. A daughter's hand was offered as part of a trade. Let's consider a real example. A 13-year-old girl named Marjorie, the daughter of a tenant farmer in 12th century England. Her father is worried. The harvest has been poor for 2 years, and their debts are rising. So when the neighboring farmer, older, but with a good plot of land and several healthy pigs, offers to take Marjorie as a wife for his 16-year-old son, the deal is made. Marjorie isn't asked if she agrees. She is simply told. Her wedding is scheduled for the next spring. She knows the boy only in passing. He once threw a stone at her when she crossed his path in the field. But now, he will be her husband. No one considers how she feels. Feelings are a luxury for bards and fools, not for farmers or noblemen. This kind of arrangement didn't just happen once. It was the norm. Girls were groomed from a young age to become wives. Their education focused on domestic skills, spinning wool, brewing ale, milking goats, cooking stews. They were taught how to obey, how to serve, how to accept. There was no conversation about dreams, aspirations, or individuality. A girl's purpose was to marry well and bear children. And for boys, they, too, were raised with the understanding that marriage was a duty, a tool, not a union of hearts but of houses. They were taught to rule over their future wives, to provide shelter and food, and to expect obedience in return. Boys learned early that their word would be final and their authority unquestioned. If they did not like their future bride, it didn't matter. Love was not the goal. Continuation was. But the most heartbreaking aspect wasn't just the arrangements or the lack of choice. It was the sheer normalcy of it all. People didn't question it. They didn't rebel. Girls wept in private, then dried their eyes and carried on. Boys groaned under the pressure but stepped into the role expected of them. The machinery of medieval society kept grinding forward, generation after generation, crushing young people under the weight of duty. In noble families, this system reached monstrous extremes. Kings married off daughters as young as 10 to secure international treaties. Dukes wed their sons to heiresses they had never met, just to gain castles or mineral rights. Sometimes the marriage contracts were signed when the children were still infants. Their fates decided before they could even walk. There were, of course, rare exceptions. A few stories where affection bloomed despite the odds. A handful of noble women who resisted. A few rebellious young men who married for love and paid the price. But these were outliers, tales whispered in corners or written into songs, often ending in tragedy. The overwhelming reality was one of silent submission. and that silence speaks volumes. The church, too, had its role to play. It preached that marriage was a sacred sacrament, but then turned a blind eye to the coercion and manipulation happening in its shadow. According to canon law, both parties had to consent for marriage to be valid. But what did consent mean in a world where girls were beaten into agreement? Where saying no meant dishonouring your family, risking poverty, or facing exile. Consent in medieval marriage was a performance, a line recited under pressure. A girl might whisper yes with tears in her eyes, her hands bruised from a father's grip. That yes was enough. That yes made everything official. It's easy to look back and judge, to think of medieval parents as cruel or heartless. But they, too, were products of their time. They believed they were doing what was best, securing safety, survival, stability. Love, after all, was seen as unreliable. What good was passion when the harvest failed? What use was affection when war came knocking? Medieval marriage was about endurance, not emotion. It was a cage built out of duty, draped in ritual, and locked with expectation. Inside that cage were thousands of silent voices, forgotten by time but no less real. As we explore deeper into the secrets and rituals of medieval unions, keep Marjorie in your mind. A girl in a wool dress, eyes wide with fear, standing at the edge of a life she didn't choose. Her story is just the beginning. He was 7, she was 6. They sat at opposite ends of a long wooden table, legs dangling off the benches, their small hands gripping wooden cups filled with watered-down ale. Around them, the adults laughed, bargained, and signed documents they couldn't read. By the time they were allowed to go outside and play, they were no longer children in the eyes of the law. They were betrothed, a contract sealed before they knew what love or freedom even meant. In medieval Europe, marriage didn't begin at the altar. It began in the cradle, or very soon after. Long before a girl wore a veil or a boy picked up a sword, their futures were decided through a custom called betrothal. These were not mere promises, but legally binding agreements, often made when the children involved were still learning to speak in full sentences. For noble families, betrothals were as serious as treaties between nations. They often were treaties between nations. A betrothal carried immense weight, sealed not with a romantic gesture, but with land, livestock, and silver. Once agreed upon, the deal was nearly impossible to break. A broken betrothal was a scandal, a financial disaster, and sometimes the spark that lit the fuse of war. Imagine a nobleman sitting with his steward, mapping out potential alliances. He has a daughter, barely 9. She is healthy, clever, and quiet, ideal traits for a future duchess. A neighboring baron has a son, aged 11, recently orphaned but heir to a decent estate. They strike a deal. The daughter is pledged to the son. To cement the arrangement, the baron offers 10 horses, 2 vineyards, and a chest of silver coins. A dowry from one side, a bride price from the other. It's not a courtship, it's a merger. The children are called in. The adults speak for them. A ring may be slipped onto a tiny finger. A document might be read aloud. Witnesses nod solemnly. The agreement is made. And in that moment, 2 lives are sealed, years before the wedding itself. Among peasants, the formalities were simpler but no less binding. Betrothals happened at markets, over mugs of ale, during harvest festivals. A father might trade his daughter's future for a share in a neighbor's grain store or the loan of 2 oxen for spring planting. Sometimes a handshake was enough. In other cases, the deal was written down by the village priest. The girl might be as young as 5, the boy not much older. For these children, the betrothal became a quiet shadow over everything. It defined their upbringing, their expectations, and their sense of self. A girl growing up knowing she was pledged might be sent to live with her future husband's family to begin learning the customs of his house. Her education would shift to suit his needs, his household's religion, his mother's rules, his land's language. And yet, this arrangement wasn't just cultural. It had the full backing of church and state. The Christian church, which taught that marriage was sacred and required mutual consent, also upheld the legality of betrothals. They claimed that a contract between children could be considered binding if it was later affirmed when they came of age. In practice, this meant that by the time the girl turned 12 and the boy 14, the marriage could be finalized with little more than verbal agreement, however forced or reluctant that agreement might be. This was the loophole that allowed countless coerced marriages to happen. You might be wondering, what if one child refused? What if a girl turned 12 and decided she did not want to marry the boy she had been pledged to at 6? The answer was bleak. Refusal was rare and dangerous. Families had invested in the match. Land had changed hands. Dowries had been paid. Backing out meant loss of wealth, loss of honor, and possibly loss of protection. For nobles, it could mean being excommunicated. For peasants, it could mean starvation. Parents would pressure their children relentlessly. Emotional manipulation, threats, and even physical violence were common tools to enforce obedience. And if all else failed, there were legal consequences. Some courts recognized broken betrothals as fraud. Girls bore the brunt of this burden. In medieval society, they were not seen as autonomous beings. A daughter was her father's property until the moment she became her husband's. Breaking a betrothal was like breaking a contract for a prized animal, except the animal would not be punished. The girl might be cast out, beaten, or sent to a convent in disgrace. And while boys had more social mobility, they too were trapped by these early pacts. A noble boy who refused his betrothed could lose his inheritance or be disinherited entirely. A peasant boy who dishonored a neighbor's daughter by refusing the agreement might find himself shunned, or worse. There are records of betrothal disputes stretching across decades. Some children were promised in infancy and forced to honor the contract 20 years later. In one infamous case from 14th century France, a woman was forced to marry a man she had been betrothed to as a toddler, even though she had long since entered a convent. The court ruled that her vows to God were invalid compared to the earlier contract signed by her father. But even more tragic are the stories we'll never know. The thousands of silent children, especially girls, who accepted their fate without protest, who were told from birth that their value lay in obedience, who learned to smile when handed over like livestock and to whisper yes even when every part of them screamed no. The cold truth was that the betrothal was not just a social tradition. It was a cage, and once the door closed, there were very few keys. It's important to understand that betrothal was not the end of childhood. It was the end of choice. From that moment on, the girl's education, movements, even clothing began to align with her future role. She was being shaped, slowly, quietly, deliberately, into someone else's wife. This early preparation often included the restriction of freedom. A betrothed girl might be forbidden from speaking with boys, from attending public gatherings alone, or from engaging in any behavior that might dishonor the agreement. Her body became a contract, her mind a vessel for duty. And all of this happened in full view of the church, sometimes even inside the church itself. Priests blessed betrothals, witnessed them, and upheld them in ecclesiastical courts. Even when the girl cried, even when the boy resisted. The institution that preached love and sanctity in marriage also enforced these cold, transactional beginnings. It's almost unbearable to imagine the lives that began this way. Marriages born not from love, but from livestock trade and land deals. Children robbed of the right to grow, to choose, to dream. As we move forward into this exploration of medieval marriage, remember that it didn't start at the altar. It started here, in a dim hall lit by torches, with the smell of wet stone and sheep dung in the air. With two children forced to shake hands while the adults around them smiled at the profits they just secured. For some, this was just tradition. For others, it was a sentence. She stood at the altar, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting between the priest and the man beside her. The man, her husband in a matter of minutes, was a stranger, older, with the permanent scowl of a man used to being obeyed. Around her, family members whispered prayers and reminders. Smile. Say yes. Don't shame us. She didn't want this. But her yes was not a choice. It was survival. The medieval world had a curious relationship with the concept of consent. On paper, and according to the church, marriage required it. Both bride and groom were expected to freely and verbally agree for the union to be valid. But what did freely really mean in a society built on power, obedience, and control? In practice, consent was often a word forced through gritted teeth, whispered under duress, or beaten out of a girl who dared to say no. Let's begin with a common scenario. A girl named Agnes, barely 12, is brought before a village priest. Her family has arranged for her to marry the blacksmith's son. He's nearly 30. The match is beneficial. The blacksmith has tools, a forge, and enough wealth to keep Agnes's family fed through winter. The father agrees. The blacksmith agrees. Even the priest agrees. But Agnes does not. She weeps. She says no. She clings to her mother's dress. Her uncle steps forward and whispers in her ear, "Say yes, or we lose everything." Her father narrows his eyes. Her mother stares straight ahead. She is surrounded by people who love her, but not enough to hear her. Eventually, Agnes nods. The priest smiles and moves forward with the ceremony. This scene was not rare. It was the rule. In the medieval mindset, a daughter's body was not her own. It was a family asset. Her marriage was a tool of survival or advancement. Her feelings were irrelevant, or worse, dangerous. A girl who refused to marry risked shaming her family, forfeiting alliances, and ruining years of planning. That, yes, the church required wasn't a question of freedom. It was a checkpoint, a hurdle, something to be extracted one way or another. Sometimes the pressure came through threats. Families warned their daughters that refusal meant being disowned, sent to a convent, or cast out. Sometimes the coercion was physical, a slap, a shove, a locked room. In more extreme cases, the girl might be restrained and forced to stand through the ceremony. And the worst part? The church still considered this consent. As long as the bride said yes, no matter how frightened or reluctant, the marriage was valid in the eyes of God. The priest had no obligation to investigate whether coercion was involved. The community certainly didn't. In fact, many believed that a crying bride was simply being emotional or modest. Tears were ignored. Protest was treated as immaturity. For boys, the pressure looked different, but it was still real. Young noblemen were often compelled to marry older widows for land rights, or women chosen by their fathers to cement political alliances. A teenage boy, perhaps freshly knighted, might be marched into a chapel to marry a woman he didn't know. His opinion didn't matter. His role was to say the words and sign the papers. Like the bride, his yes was expected, not offered. But girls faced a much crueler fate when they refused. A famous case recorded in the 13th century tells of a girl named Alice of Bath who refused her arranged marriage. She fled to a convent, seeking sanctuary. Her father, furious, stormed the abbey and dragged her out by force. The bishop ruled in his favor. She was returned home and married off days later. The marriage stood. Her attempt to claim spiritual refuge was denied. Such stories reveal how deeply the system was stacked against young women. Their consent was symbolic, like a stamp on a contract already written. The entire weight of their family's reputation, financial future, and survival rested on their compliance. Saying no wasn't just a personal decision. It was seen as betrayal. In noble circles, this betrayal could become treason. Royal daughters were pawns on a much bigger board. A refusal to marry could unravel alliances between kingdoms. In 1291, Princess Margaret of Norway, only 7 years old, was betrothed to Edward of Carnarvon, heir to the English throne. When she died before the marriage could take place, it triggered a succession crisis and years of political tension. If a princess had refused outright, it could mean war. This pressure created a generation of girls who were trained not to feel, not to dream, and certainly not to resist. They were taught early to accept that their destiny lay in marriage, and that any hesitation would bring punishment. Stories, songs, and religious lessons reinforced this idea. The Virgin Mary was obedient. Saints submitted to suffering. Wives were praised when they were silent and scorned when they resisted. In this atmosphere, even the illusion of choice was dangerous. A girl who said no might be accused of pride, vanity, or even witchcraft. After all, what kind of girl thought she was too good for her father's chosen match? Where had she learned such rebellion? And so, the word yes became one of the most abused words in medieval vocabulary. It was not a promise of love. It was not a pledge of trust. It was a tool of survival. And for some, it was a whispered farewell to freedom. But what about the few who resisted? There were rebels, young women who ran away, disguised themselves, or pleaded for annulments. Some found refuge in convents or under the protection of sympathetic nobles. A few succeeded in delaying or overturning forced marriages, but they were rare. For every girl who escaped, 1,000 more did not. Their yes became the first word in a lifetime of obedience. And the system didn't stop there. Once married, women faced even more restrictions. Their consent was no longer needed. Not for household decisions, not for intimacy, not even for childbearing. The yes, they said at the altar, became a lifelong contract of surrender. And there were no second chances. To say no after the ceremony, to refuse their husband's authority, was considered sinful. Disobedient wives were scorned, punished, and in some cases, publicly humiliated. The church did not come to their defense. The law did not hear their cries. The medieval marriage system was a machine, and consent was the oil that kept it running. Extracted from children, crushed from women, repackaged as virtue. As we continue exploring this dark history, never forget that behind every yes was often 1,000 fears, a dozen threats, and the unbearable weight of an entire family's survival. A word is not a choice when the consequences of refusal are worse than surrender. When King Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine, he didn't just gain a wife. He gained half of modern-day France. That single union doubled his kingdom, changed the map of Europe, and sparked decades of political upheaval. This was the medieval world's most powerful truth. Marriages didn't just unite people. They moved armies, dictated economies, and toppled empires. In modern life, marriage is ideally about companionship, shared goals, emotional intimacy. But in medieval Europe, it was something far more calculated. It was a political weapon, a legal strategy, and an economic deal rolled into one. The concept of marrying for love was practically unheard of among the elite, and often mocked when it appeared. Who would be foolish enough to marry for feelings when so much could be gained through marriage for land, status, or wealth? At the heart of the medieval power structure was land. Land meant wealth. It meant control over labor, taxation, and military force. The more land a noble family controlled, the more influence they had with the king, with the church, and over their rivals. But land didn't change hands easily unless it was passed down through marriage. And so, daughters were the keys to castles. Sons were the locks that fit them. In noble households, marriage negotiations were handled like state affairs. Fathers met with other patriarchs in shadowed halls, flanked by stewards, priests, and lawyers. They laid out maps and family trees, counting cattle and counting kin. If a daughter was especially beautiful or came with a large dowry, her marriage might command alliances with families several rungs above her own. If a son had titles but no fortune, he might need to marry into a merchant family for funds. The match was always strategic. These weren't quiet arrangements. They had international consequences. Take Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, for instance. Their marriage in 1469 did not begin with poetry or longing. It began with fear that Spain would fracture into smaller kingdoms forever. Their union merged two powerful realms and paved the way for the eventual unification of Spain. It also allowed them to finance exploration missions, including the voyage of Christopher Columbus. A marriage changed global history. This same logic played out in lesser-known but equally pivotal cases. Consider a small barony in the Swiss Alps. A local lord's only heir is a daughter. Her hand is sought not for love, but because she owns the only pass through the mountains that doesn't freeze over in winter. Whoever marries her doesn't just gain a wife. He gains control over trade routes, military positioning, and seasonal power. One winter wedding secures domination over entire valleys. Among the nobility, this wasn't just common, it was expected. A son who refused to marry for power could be disinherited. A daughter who failed to marry well could doom her family's future. Even the church reinforced this idea. Bishops and abbots often helped broker marriages, especially when it benefited church land or influence. Some marriages were even coordinated by the Pope himself. The outcomes weren't always peaceful. There were wars started over broken engagements. There were cities sacked because a bride's dowry was disputed. In the 14th century, a canceled betrothal between an English princess and a Spanish prince led to an economic blockade and years of skirmishes between their kingdoms. Feelings were not at stake, territory was. And yet, this logic wasn't limited to kings and queens. Even commoners used marriage to consolidate assets. A peasant farmer with 3 sons and a failing crop might arrange for one of his boys to marry the daughter of a prosperous miller. In exchange, he receives access to the mill, better grain prices, and a promise that his family won't starve in winter. The marriage becomes the contract that keeps both households afloat. Among merchants and craftsmen, daughters were frequently married off to rivals or former enemies to forge new partnerships. Sometimes, a marriage was the final clause in a business negotiation. A blacksmith's daughter might be offered to the tanner's son in return for year-round leather supply. These weren't romantic deals. They were mergers, and the expectations were ruthless. A girl's beauty mattered only so far as it enhanced her market value. A boy's charm meant nothing if he had no skills, titles, or prospects. Marriage was rarely about personality. It was about leverage. And just like a transaction, if either party failed to deliver, say, if the bride was discovered not to be a virgin, or the groom's estate was not as large as promised, the fallout could be devastating. There are recorded cases where dowries led to murder. A noblewoman's father, having promised a significant dowry to secure her marriage, failed to deliver all of it. The groom's family, feeling cheated, ambushed and killed the bride's brother in retaliation. In a world where honor was currency, a disputed dowry could mean bloodshed. One of the most infamous examples of marriage as politics was the 100 Years' War between England and France. It began in part because of a marriage claim. King Edward III of England declared that, through his mother's royal blood, he had a rightful claim to the French throne. His mother had married into the French royal family generations earlier, and now that marriage became the reason for a century of war. Hundreds of thousands died because of a marital alliance crafted long ago in a royal court. But what about love? In most cases, love was not just absent. It was a liability. Falling in love with someone below your station or outside of your strategic interests was considered foolish, reckless, and sometimes punishable. There are documented cases where noble daughters were placed in convents for falling in love with stable boys or musicians. Sons who refused arranged marriages and insisted on marrying for love risked being cut off entirely. And yet, love did find its way through the cracks. Courtly love, the concept of longing from afar, of passion outside of marriage, became a literary fantasy. It flourished in songs and poems, often because real love was forbidden. Troubadours sang of unattainable women. Knights wrote verses to married noble women, and wives penned secret letters to distant lovers. Because the reality was this: marriage was often too sacred a tool to waste on love. As the feudal system grew more complex, so too did the political power of marriage. By the 11th and 12th centuries, families weren't just marrying for land. They were marrying to ensure dynastic succession. A queen's ability to produce a male heir was the most critical part of the marriage contract. If she failed, the consequences could be fatal. Queen Bertha of the Netherlands, as we mentioned before, was repudiated by her husband King Philip I of France. Not because she was unfaithful, not because she was cruel, but because she didn't give him a son. He replaced her with another woman, married in secret, and ignored the church's disapproval. His actions weren't seen as scandalous. They were seen as practical. That was the harsh core of medieval marriage. Results mattered more than promises. Marriages that produced heirs were good. Marriages that brought land were better. Marriages that changed the course of history, those were legendary. In this ruthless world, marriage was never about joining two hearts. It was about joining empires. The bells rang. The crowd gathered. But this was no fairy tale. The bride stood still as stone outside the church doors, her face pale beneath the veil. The groom, often a stranger, waited beside her, not to whisper vows of love, but to claim what was now his. The priest raised his hand, not to bless two souls in union, but to mark a transaction complete. This was no celebration of love. It was a ceremony of control. In medieval Europe, weddings were not intimate affairs. They were ceremonies of spectacle, carried out in full view of the community, often with an agenda that went far beyond the bride and groom. While modern weddings tend to celebrate romance, individual choice, and personal commitment, medieval weddings were designed to do something far more specific. Demonstrate ownership, cement alliances, and remind everyone exactly who belonged to whom. And it all began outside the church doors. That's right. In many regions of Europe, particularly from the 11th to 14th centuries, weddings didn't take place inside the sanctuary. The couple stood outside, under the open sky, before the community and under the watchful eye of the priest. Why? Because the marriage was as much a civil contract as a sacred one. The church's role was to bless it, not to hide it. By holding the ceremony outside, every member of the village could see it, remember it, and witness who was marrying whom. The crowd was essential. This was not a private promise. It was a public declaration of transfer, akin to a land sale or property exchange. Let's imagine such a ceremony. The bride, no more than 13, stands on the groom's left, the position traditionally reserved for women, which symbolized their secondary role in society. Her hands are folded. She says nothing unless prompted. Her veil covers her face not for modesty or mystery, but for business, to prevent any last-minute objections about her appearance. The groom doesn't need to love her. He needs her lands, her name, or her womb. The veil protects the deal, not the girl. The priest begins the Latin vows. He speaks of duty, of permanence, of roles. The groom is promised obedience from his wife. The bride is told she must honor and serve. He will rule the household. She will submit to his will. The rings are exchanged, and the woman is now marked. Her body, her future, even her voice, legally and spiritually claimed. This was the ritual of possession. And then, before entering the church for a blessing, came the most symbolic gesture, the father placing the bride's hand into the groom's. This was not a sweet moment. It was a legal act of transference. The bride had belonged to her father. Now she belonged to her husband. This symbolic handover represented the loss of her identity, her legal standing, and her independence. She could not own property. She could not refuse her husband. She could not make decisions without his consent. Her life was no longer hers, and the whole village watched it happen. This is important to understand. Everyone had to see it. The crowd wasn't just there to celebrate. They were there to remember. In case of future disputes about dowries, heirs, or inheritance, witnesses could testify. Yes, I saw them married. Yes, she said yes. Yes, the priest was there. Yes, he placed the ring on her finger. In this way, the community became enforcers of the marriage contract. If the bride tried to flee, they would return her. If the husband abused her, they might ignore it. If the family fought over land, they would quote the day she was given away. Following the vows, the couple entered the church for Mass, if they could afford it. Among nobles, the ceremony could become lavish, involving choirs, incense, and robed bishops. Among peasants, it was brief and simple. Either way, the church's blessing came after the couple had already committed to each other. The church ratified what society had already made real. But the wedding did not end with the blessing. In fact, it had only just begun. After the ceremony came the feast. And this, too, was less about joy and more about display. Food was plentiful for the wealthy. Music echoed through great halls, and guests from miles around came not simply to celebrate, but to judge. This was the family's moment to show off their wealth, their power, their alliances. A well-attended feast wasn't just a party. It was proof of status. Among nobles, guests might include visiting dignitaries, knights, and rival houses, all watching, all assessing. What were the bride's clothes made of? How fat was the goose? How many barrels of wine? This wasn't about the bride and groom at all. It was about the families. And in the midst of this performance, the newlyweds were expected to sit still, smile, and remain symbols of the contract. The bride might be paraded, made to dance, or presented like a prize. Her silence was admired. Her obedience praised. Everything in the wedding, the setting, the structure, the food, the vows, served to reinforce one central idea. The woman now belonged to her husband, and the marriage was the foundation of control, not affection. Even the ring had meaning beyond love. Placed on the fourth finger, which medieval scholars believed was connected directly to the heart, the ring was not a token of emotion. It was a marker of possession. Just like a seal on a document or a brand on cattle, it signaled to everyone, this woman has been claimed. We must also remember that these weddings were not always peaceful. Some required guards, especially in noble families. The best man, today a jovial friend with a toast, began as the bride's guard. He stood next to the groom, not to hold a ring, but to hold a sword. His job was to stop the bride from running or fight off any rival who might try to interrupt. In some stories, rival suitors tried to crash the ceremony. Families argued at the altar. In rare cases, brides screamed or fainted. And still, the priest carried on. The vows were said. The ring was placed. The father gave her away. The contract was complete. And the bride? She was a ghost in her own story, barely heard, hardly seen, veiled until the moment she was finally revealed, only after the deal was sealed. Let's not mistake these rituals as merely outdated customs. They were deeply embedded tools of control, passed down generation after generation. They taught women their place. They taught men their right to rule. And they taught communities how to enforce both. This was marriage as spectacle, as law, as property transfer. And behind the music, behind the veils, behind the smiling guests, one truth always remained. This was not a celebration of love. It was a declaration of ownership. It seemed harmless enough. A veil over a young girl's face, a man standing on her right with a sword at his hip, her hand being placed into his. But in medieval Europe, these gestures weren't sweet traditions. They were calculated moves in a game of control. Every inch of the ceremony, from the rings to the prayers, was steeped in meaning. And that meaning was chilling. This is no longer her life. She now belongs to him. To the untrained eye, a medieval wedding might have seemed festive, even sacred. There were blessings and bells, wine and music, and the flutter of lace and banners. But beneath the surface was a ceremony designed not for emotional union, but for legal domination. The medieval marriage ritual was a script, one written by patriarchy, sanctioned by the church, and enforced by society. Let's break it down. The placement of the bride and groom was the first symbol. The groom always stood on the right side of the priest, the favored side, and the bride on the left. This was not arbitrary. In Christian symbolism, the right hand of God represented power and judgment, the left, weakness and submission. Even their positioning at the altar declared the roles they were about to inhabit. Next came the veil. Today, we often view it as a symbol of modesty or mystery. In the Middle Ages, it had a far more practical and sinister purpose. Most noble marriages were arranged, and the couple might not meet until the day of the wedding. The veil concealed the bride's face until after the vows, preventing the groom from objecting based on her appearance. In other words, the veil protected the contract, not the woman. This created situations where a groom could only see his wife after she was legally his. If he was displeased, it didn't matter. The deal was sealed. The veil ensured compliance over consent. Then came the moment when the bride's father would place her hand into the groom's. This was no sentimental gesture. It was a legal transfer of authority. The bride was now no longer under her father's protection. She was under her husband's command. This moment marked the end of her legal personhood. From now on, she could not own property, sign contracts, or make independent decisions without her husband's permission. In many kingdoms, a woman's testimony in court was considered invalid unless approved by her husband. A vow at the altar had transformed her from a daughter to a dependent. Another key part of the ritual was the ring. The groom placed down the fourth finger of the bride's left hand, a tradition still followed today. In medieval belief, that finger contained a vein that led directly to the heart. But this romantic idea masked a deeper reality. The ring was a mark of ownership. Much like a seal on a document or a crest on a banner, it showed the world that she had been claimed. Interestingly, in many medieval cultures, only the bride received a ring. The groom wore nothing. There was no mutual exchange. This one-sided ritual wasn't about partnership. It was about branding. It was the final visible proof that she belonged to someone else. And who stood beside the groom? The best man, originally called the bride's guard. His job wasn't to hold the ring or tell jokes. It was to prevent disruptions, especially from rivals or the bride herself. In a world where elopements and runaway brides were real risks, the best man stood ready with his sword. If the bride hesitated or tried to flee, it was his duty to restrain her. If another suitor tried to challenge the groom, the best man would fight to secure the bride's claim. The presence of this armed guard made it clear this was not a peaceful joining. It was a controlled transaction, and force would be used if necessary. Let's not forget the prayers and church blessings. The priest called upon God to sanctify the marriage, yes, but more importantly, to enforce roles. The bride was reminded of her duty to obey. The groom was reminded of his duty to protect, which in medieval language meant command and correct. Passages from Ephesians were often read aloud. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. It was more than scripture. It was script handed down through generations to ensure that the hierarchy within the home was never questioned. Other rituals varied by region, but carried the same tone of hierarchy and control. In parts of Germany, for instance, the bride had to remove her shoes and stand on them during the vows, a sign of humility. In parts of France, she was required to kneel while her husband remained standing. In England, some brides were symbolically dragged from their homes, laughing or not, to show that her life of independence was over. Among peasants, the rituals were more informal, but just as symbolic. A bride might be seated on a sack of grain to represent fertility, while the groom offered her a tool, a hoe, a plow handle, representing her new labor role. These objects weren't metaphors. They were assignments. Even the wedding feast reinforced these dynamics. The couple's first meal was often served in a specific order. The groom ate first, the bride second, never together. In noble families, guests watched how obedient the bride was during the feast. Did she remain quiet? Did she pour her husband's wine without being asked? These were social tests, not celebrations. After the feast came one of the most intrusive traditions, the bedding ceremony. We'll explore this in detail in a later section, but here's the brief. The community escorted the couple to bed. Sometimes they stayed to witness the consummation, or at least wait nearby. This ritual symbolized more than physical intimacy. It symbolized completion of ownership. The woman's body, once her own, at least in theory, was now part of the marriage contract. What had been declared publicly now became private reality, and again, enforced by ritual. In every stage of the ceremony, from the positioning of hands to the final prayers, the medieval wedding broadcast one message. This marriage is not about love. It is about power. It was about who holds it, who loses it, and who is required to submit to it. If a bride cried during the vows, it was called modesty. If she resisted, she was shamed. If she smiled too much, she was warned not to act too proud. Her behavior was monitored. Her silence was praised. Her obedience was assumed. And while this ritual looked sacred, dressed in fine robes and sung in holy hymns, it was at its core a performance of domination. Every word, every gesture, every tradition, each one carefully choreographed, each one designed to transform a girl into a possession and a marriage into a legally and spiritually binding chain. In today's world, many of these customs have softened, evolved into symbols of affection, but their roots remain tangled in this history. A history where weddings weren't the start of a mutual journey. They were the moment a woman's life was taken out of her hands and placed into someone else's. They waited outside the chamber, hushed and expectant. In the flickering candlelight, a girl no older than 12 sat on a wide bed, her hands clenched in her lap. Her husband, twice her age, stood beside her, unbuckling his belt. The priest had blessed them, the feast had ended, and now the true test began. Not of love, not of trust, but of blood, because in medieval Europe, a woman's future could be written in red across a sheet. In the medieval world, virginity wasn't just a private matter. It was public proof of purity, loyalty, and value. For noble women especially, it wasn't simply a spiritual virtue. It was a political necessity. And after the wedding, the pressure to prove it was immense. Let's begin with the why. In a time before paternity tests, virginity was the only assurance the nobleman's heir was truly his. A virgin bride was seen as a blank slate, her body untouched, her womb unclaimed. If she bore a son, no one could challenge the child's legitimacy. But if there was any suspicion, any whisper that she had lain with another man, her entire marriage could collapse. And with it, alliances, land claims, and dynastic lines. This is why virginity became a legal matter, not just a moral one. The church spoke of chastity as holy, but nobles and peasants turned that ideal into a contract. A girl was expected to arrive at the wedding untouched, and after the ceremony, prove it in the most invasive way imaginable. The practice was known as the virginity test. Here's how it worked. After the wedding feast ended and the guests grew drunk on wine, the newlywed couple was led, or in some cases escorted, to their marriage bed. Sometimes a priest would bless the sheets. Sometimes musicians would play bawdy songs. And then, the doors were closed. What happened next was supposed to be private, but it wasn't. Because in many households, especially among the nobility, the sheets were checked the next morning. Servants, mothers-in-law, or even priests came to inspect them. Bloodstains were the key. If there was blood, it was assumed the girl had been a virgin and the marriage was confirmed. If not, whispers began. In some regions, the bloodstained sheet was shown to family members, sometimes held aloft, sometimes paraded before the remaining guests. It was a grotesque symbol of satisfaction, not unlike a signed treaty or a trophy from battle. This wasn't just tradition. It had consequences. If the sheet was clean, the bride's honor could be questioned. Her dowry might be withheld. Her family might be shamed or sued. In extreme cases, the husband could demand an annulment, declaring the marriage invalid and the bride spoiled. Among royalty, this could be catastrophic. A queen whose virginity was questioned risked losing her throne, her children declared bastards, her name smeared across history. And what of the girl? She was rarely asked what had happened. Maybe there had been blood, but it hadn't soaked the sheet. Maybe she had been violated before the marriage, through assault or coercion, but no one cared. Innocence was measured by blood, not by truth. Let's look at a real example. In 15th century Castile, Princess Blanca of Navarre was married off to Prince Enrique of Trastamara. On their wedding night, there was no blood. The prince later claimed she was either barren or not a virgin. The marriage was annulled. Blanca's reputation never recovered. Whether or not she was innocent didn't matter. The absence of blood became a verdict. But even among peasants, this ritual had weight. In small villages, if a newlywed couple failed to produce a blood-stained sheet, the bride might be mocked, beaten, or shunned. Rumors would spread. Men would jeer at her in the street. Women would cross themselves when she passed. In communities where family honor meant survival, a dishonored daughter could destroy years of careful alliance building. Some families, desperate to avoid shame, went to great lengths. There are records of mothers pricking their daughters' fingers and staining the sheet before morning. Others hid vials of animal blood under the mattress to be smeared after the act. These were acts of fear, not deception, last-ditch efforts to protect a girl from disgrace and violence. And the church? It condemned fornication. It preached chastity, but it did not condemn the inspection of sheets or the public shaming of girls. In fact, some bishops encouraged it, arguing that it reinforced the holiness of marriage and the purity of Christian homes. The truth is, the system wasn't designed to protect women. It was designed to protect men's pride and property. A virgin bride was considered proof of honor, loyalty, and control, a possession still sealed. A girl who failed to prove her virginity wasn't just seen as disobedient. She was seen as damaged goods. But what about the men? There was no such test for grooms, no requirement for purity. A nobleman could arrive at the wedding with a history of mistresses and brothel visits, and no one would question his honor. His virility was praised, her experience condemned. This double standard ran deep. Men were expected to take control. Women were expected to arrive docile, untouched, and grateful. If a bride cried on her wedding night, it was called nerves. If she bled, it was called virtue. If she fought back, it was called rebellion. Some girls were so young, so unprepared, that the wedding night was more than terrifying. It was traumatic. There are records of noble women dying from injuries sustained on their wedding night, especially when married before puberty. But the system demanded proof. If a girl survived but no blood was seen, she could be blamed. The obsession with virginity shaped every part of a girl's upbringing. From the age of 7 or 8, noble daughters were watched constantly, forbidden from speaking with male servants, denied time alone outdoors, and warned of the shame that would come if they spoiled themselves. This obsession didn't fade after marriage. If a woman was accused of infidelity, her virginity at the time of marriage would be used as a defense. She was pure then, so her children are legitimate, lawyers might argue. In legal disputes over heirs, the blood on the wedding sheets could become a key piece of evidence. It was never just about the woman. It was about the reputation of the men around her. Her father, her husband, her sons. Her body carried the honor of the entire family, and a single stain, or lack thereof, could ruin them all. This brutal reality stripped young women of agency, dignity, and privacy. Their most intimate experiences became public property. Their worth was decided not by character or wisdom, but by anatomy, and by the ignorance of a culture that equated blood with truth. As we move forward in our exploration, the rituals of control and humiliation only deepen. But this, the demand for visible proof of virginity, may be one of the most haunting, because it wasn't about love. It wasn't even about sex. It was about evidence. Imagine your wedding day. The feast has ended, the guests are gone, and your new husband leads you to your modest home. But at the door, someone is waiting. Not a friend, not a relative, a nobleman, your lord. And tonight, he will take your place in your bed. Not because of love, not because of law, but because he can. This is not fiction. This is the shadow of a tradition that terrified peasants for generations. A tradition known as jus primi noctis. Jus primi noctis, also called the rite of the first night, is one of the most infamous customs associated with medieval marriage. The idea was simple, brutal, and chilling. A feudal lord had the right to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night, before her husband could. It was a symbol of ultimate authority, not just over land, livestock, and taxes, but over the most intimate corners of life. But was it real? Historians today remain divided. Some argue that jus primi noctis was more legend than law, a myth born from fear, songs, and whispered outrage. Others insist it did exist, perhaps not universally enforced, but real enough to inspire laws that later banned it. The truth lies somewhere in between, and wherever it was practiced, its impact was devastating. To understand how this custom might have worked, we must revisit the feudal structure of medieval Europe. Lords ruled over villages, and villages owed them not only taxes and labor, but also obedience. A peasant couldn't marry without his lord's permission. He couldn't farm, move, or even bury his dead without some form of feudal oversight. Marriage was no exception. In some territories, lord claimed not just approval rights, but a first claim on the bride's body. Let's paint the scene. You are a 16-year-old girl in 13th century France. You've just married the boy next door, a farmer's son. Your wedding was simple, a church blessing, a shared meal, maybe a bit of dancing. But when night falls, instead of going to bed with your husband, a messenger arrives. You've been summoned to the Lord's manor. You go, Not because you want to, but because you must. To refuse would mean losing your home, your field, your husband's job, your family's protection. Some girls went alone. Others were escorted by guards. Some lords demanded the entire village celebrate while he took his right. Others preferred silence. Either way, your first night as a married woman did not belong to you. Was this universal? No, but where it existed, or even where people believed it existed, it left scars. Scars that appeared in literature, folklore, and even tax records. In many medieval regions, peasants could pay a fine to avoid the custom. These fees were known by different names: cullage in France, merchant in England, or for marriage elsewhere. These payments were framed as marriage fees. But the implication was clear. You were buying back your wife's body. Even if the act didn't happen, the threat was real. A young bride might spend her wedding day fearing a knock at the door. A groom might carry shame or rage, unable to protect his wife. And the community, powerless to intervene, might simply accept it as part of the feudal order. The church, predictably, said little. While it preached purity and marriage as sacred, it rarely challenged the authority of lords. In some regions, clergy even collected similar first-night payments, further blurring the line between spiritual guidance and economic coercion. There were also cases where the church seemed to recognize and respond to the problem. In the 13th century, King Alfonso X of Castile issued laws condemning any man who claimed the right to sleep with a bride not his own. Similar decrees appeared in Scotland, northern Italy, and parts of France. Why write a law banning something, unless someone was practicing it? In literature, the custom appeared often, usually as a symbol of tyranny. In old French ballads, English plays, and Spanish epic poems, we see lords demanding a bride's body and brave husbands fighting back. These stories fueled anger, fear, and protest, suggesting that whether or not just primi noctis was routine, it was certainly believable. One of the most famous references comes from Beaumarchais's 18th century play The Marriage of Figaro. The villain, Count Almaviva, tries to invoke an old feudal right to sleep with Figaro's bride, Suzanne. The play treats it as tradition, something abolished but remembered. Even in Enlightenment France, the echo of just primi noctis was still strong enough to stir outrage. But beneath the legend is a truth we can't ignore. The custom didn't need to be widespread to be terrifying, because what it represented was far more powerful than the act itself. It represented a world where a woman's body was not her own, where marriage didn't protect her, but marked her as available, where power meant control, not just of laws and land, but of people's most private selves. The lord who could claim your wife on her wedding night wasn't just powerful. He was untouchable. This idea created a culture of fear, especially among peasants. Even if the custom wasn't practiced in their village, the rumor that it could happen was enough. Parents worried, husbands prayed, brides cried, and communities paid. Whether through coins, livestock, or silence, they paid. Let's return to that girl, the one standing at the door of her new home, her new life, only to find a nobleman waiting to take it away. She may never speak of it. Her children may never know. But her wedding night becomes a wound, not just on her body, but on the very meaning of marriage. In this way, just primi noctis, real or not, became a weapon of submission. It was a myth, yes, but a myth enforced by law, by silence, by tradition. And even if only a handful of men ever exercised it, millions feared it. In today's world, we look back and ask, how could this be allowed? How could entire villages live under such control? But to them, it was simply the world. A world where lords owned land, owned labor, and sometimes owned the first night. The crowd sang and laughed as the newlyweds were led by torchlight to the bed. Jugs of ale sloshed, flutes played, and bawdy jokes flew through the smoky air. The bride kept her eyes on the floor. Her husband gripped her arm tightly. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Because tonight, their wedding night, wasn't theirs. It belonged to everyone watching. In today's world, the idea of the wedding night is intimate, sacred, a quiet moment after the noise of celebration. But in medieval Europe, particularly across large parts of France, Germany, England, in Scandinavia, the bedding ceremony transformed that moment into a public spectacle, one that blurred the line between celebration and intrusion. The ceremony wasn't optional. It was tradition, and in many places, it was considered proof that the marriage had truly occurred. Here's how it often happened. After the wedding feast, after the last toast and the final song, guests didn't simply say goodnight. They gathered, and sometimes marched, to the couple's sleeping quarters. In noble families, this could be a luxurious chamber in a stone manor. In peasant villages, it might be a loft above the barn or side room off the main hall. Regardless of wealth, the message was the same. The marriage isn't complete until the couple has been put to bed. That phrase, put to bed, was literal. The bride and groom were escorted, sometimes carried, and frequently watched as they entered the bedroom. The bed would often be adorned with clean white linens, sometimes blessed by a priest earlier that day. Torches were lit, wine flowed, and the couple stood, awkwardly, at the center of the room while family, friends, and officials surrounded them. But it didn't stop there. In many communities, guests would help undress the bride and groom. Not as a joke, not as a prank, but as part of the ritual. This was often done while songs were sung, usually crude and heavily suggestive, mocking or teasing the couple. Sometimes the bride's hair was unbraided by her mother or the village elder, a symbol of a new role as a wife. Sometimes her shoes were removed by her mother-in-law, to show she now walked under a different roof. What followed varied by region and class. In Scotland, for instance, it was enough for the couple to be seen in bed together, covered by blankets. A priest or noble witness might stand nearby to verify they had shared the bed. If the groom kissed the bride or lay beside her for a certain period of time, the bedding was declared complete. In Germany, however, especially in certain towns during the 14th and 15th centuries, the ceremony could be far more intrusive. Guests might linger in the room, standing just behind a curtain or screen. In some extreme cases, several men, often 6 or more, were required to witness the consummation itself. Their job wasn't to stare, but to listen for sounds, verify physical signs, and ensure there was no deception. Why such extremes? Because consummation sealed the marriage. Without it, the marriage could later be declared invalid, especially if property, inheritance, or noble bloodlines were at stake. In a world where marriages were political and strategic, physical proof mattered. The bedding wasn't about trust. It was about evidence. The ceremony didn't always end in the bedroom. In some places, the bloodstained sheets were taken the next morning and displayed for the family, or in some bizarre cases, for the entire village. This overlapped with the virginity test we explored earlier, turning the wedding night into a final exam, not of love, but of proof, purity, and duty. And what of the couple? Imagine the terror, the humiliation. A bride, no older than 13, already frightened by a stranger she now must call husband, is undressed in front of a family and handed to him like a gift. She's told to lie still, to be quiet, to perform her role. Her new husband, possibly twice her age, may be just as nervous or far more eager. He, too, knows he is being judged, not just as a man, but as a claimant to her body and to whatever power or land she brings. There was no refuge, no privacy. Even in peasant villages, where ceremony was simpler, the expectation remained. A father might wait outside the door, oppressed to the wood. A neighbor might linger nearby. And if the couple didn't emerge with smiles or proof, questions began immediately. Was she unwilling? Was he incapable? Was something wrong? This kind of public inspection wasn't limited to rural life. In royal courts, it reached surreal levels. There are accounts of monarchs being bedded while high-ranking courtiers, bishops, dukes, or even the king, stood nearby to verify the act had taken place. The stakes were too high to leave it to chance. If the queen did not conceive, if heirs were not born, the dynasty could fall. It was not just medieval Europe, either. In Iceland, marriage was not considered legally valid until 6 men witnessed the bedding. In parts of France, the couple was expected to sit naked in bed while witnesses offered them drinks and sang songs. The entire process was designed to transition a woman from daughter to wife, not just legally, but physically and publicly. Let's return for a moment to the couple at the center of this. No matter how refined the decorations, how fine the clothes, how lavish the food, the wedding night brought them into sharp focus. It wasn't about their connection. It wasn't about their feelings. It was about possession, about ensuring that what the groom had been promised was delivered, about letting the village know the bride was claimed, sealed, and no longer free. And if something went wrong, if the groom could not perform, if the bride refused, there could be annulments, shame, and scandal. Sometimes the bride was blamed, accused of bewitching or defying the marriage. Sometimes the groom's masculinity was questioned, a blow that could ruin his social standing. In rare cases, the marriage was reattempted the next night, with even more pressure and even more eyes waiting on the outcome. This ritual did not foster intimacy. It crushed it. It robbed couples of tenderness, replaced nervous excitement with shame, fear, and performance. The marriage bed, ideally a space of closeness, became a stage, one where the bride was on display, the groom was judged, and the entire community claimed a stake in their union. For women especially, this meant that not even the bedroom belonged to them. Not on their wedding night. Not ever. Their body was part of a public contract, and fulfilling that contract wasn't just expected, it was witnessed. It is hard to overstate how damaging this was. A generation of women were trained not only to obey, but to submit in public. A generation of men were raised to expect performance, not partnership. The very structure of the bedding ceremony taught that love was irrelevant, privacy was unnecessary, and pleasure, especially for women, was non-existent. As we continue into the next stages of medieval marriage, we'll see how these expectations didn't fade after the wedding night. If anything, they hardened, turning into rules, religious laws, and moral chains that governed every aspect of a woman's life. But it all began here, with a torchlit march, with strangers in your bedroom, with your first night on display. They were newlyweds, young and curious. One night, they reached for each other, but it was Friday, a holy day. Another time, she kissed him after a long fast, and he turned away, reminding her it was Lent. She wept after childbirth, longing for comfort, but he told her the priest had forbidden it for 40 days. In their marriage bed, it wasn't their hearts or bodies in control. It was the church. In the Middle Ages, marriage was considered a sacred sacrament. But the church's grip didn't stop at the altar. Once the vows were said, the priest's blessing extended into the bedroom, dictating not only when and how couples could be intimate, but why. Because according to church doctrine, the only acceptable reason for physical intimacy was procreation, the making of children. Anything else, desire, pleasure, comfort, was viewed with suspicion. Even within marriage, passion was dangerous. Lust, even for one's own spouse, could be a sin. A married couple had to walk a spiritual tightrope, close enough to create life, but never indulge in too much enjoyment. Let's begin with the calendar. The church laid out an astonishingly complex set of restrictions on when couples could be intimate. Entire sections of the year were considered off-limits. Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas. Lent, the 40 days before Easter. Pentecost week, the eve of every major feast day. Every Friday, in remembrance of Christ's crucifixion. Every Sunday, the Lord's Day. Wednesdays and Saturdays in some areas. During menstruation. During pregnancy. While breastfeeding. 40 days after childbirth. If you follow those rules, there are very few safe days left each year. Scholars estimate that, on average, medieval couples were permitted just 100 to 120 nights per year for intimacy. And that's assuming both partners were healthy, present, and in agreement. But even on approved nights, not all acts were acceptable. The church issued guidance, often disturbingly detailed, about permissible positions, duration, and intent. Missionary position was encouraged as the most natural and least sinful. Anything that seemed to involve pleasure for its own sake, especially for women, was condemned. Some priests even taught that it was better to suppress enjoyment entirely, lest one fall into mortal sin. And these were not just whispered warnings. These teachings were written in manuals, sermons, and confession guides. One infamous example was the penitentials, church-authored rulebooks for confessors, which cataloged a wide range of sexual behaviors and their corresponding punishments. For example, a man who lay with his wife out of lust alone might be required to fast for 10 to 15 days. A couple who were intimate during forbidden times might be banned from taking communion. A woman who expressed too much desire could be accused of moral weakness, or even of being influenced by demonic temptation. In other words, intimacy wasn't private. It was policed, and that policing wasn't equal. Men's desires were often excused. If a husband insisted on being with his wife during a restricted time, it was sometimes tolerated. After all, he had needs. But a woman's desires were rarely seen as valid. A wife who approached her husband too eagerly could be reprimanded in confession. In some communities, she could even be accused of causing marital discord or spiritual danger. This created a crushing double standard. A man could be demanding, even cruel, and still be seen as devout, so long as his actions produced children. But a woman who sought connection or pleasure was seen as shameful, or worse, sinful. Then there was the concept of the marital debt. According to medieval canon law, a wife could not refuse her husband's request for intimacy, ever. To do so was considered not only insubordination, but sin. This idea came from interpretations of the Bible, particularly 1 Corinthians 7 verses 3 to 5, where Paul wrote that the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. In practice, this meant that marital rape was not recognized as a crime. A husband could demand his rights at any time. If a wife said no, she was urged to confess her disobedience, not to be defended. In the rare case that a woman did complain to her priest, she was typically told to submit, pray, and endure. And what are the husband's obligations? Technically, he was also expected to honor the marital debt, meaning he could not deny his wife either. But this rule was rarely enforced, and certainly not with the same intensity. A woman who was refused might be pitted, but not defended. Her only real recourse was prayer or silence. It's important to remember that not all clergy agreed with this level of control. Some monastic writers, especially in later centuries, began to advocate for tenderness and mutual respect within marriage. The 12th century monk Peter Abelard, for instance, wrote letters to Heloise expressing admiration for her intellect and independence. But these ideas remained exceptions, not the norm. In most parishes, the local priest acted as both spiritual guide and moral enforcer. His words shaped what was acceptable in the marriage bed. Couples might confess private moments, ask questions, or seek approval. But in doing so, they opened the door to judgment, restriction, and shame. Let's revisit a couple from the 14th century. They've been married a few years. The wife is breastfeeding their second child. The husband desires her, but she refuses, citing the church's 40-day rule. He becomes angry. He tells her she's denying him his rights. She weeps. Later, she confesses to the priest, who tells her to be more obedient. He reminds her that her body is not her own. She leaves the church not comforted, but corrected. This scenario played out thousands of times across Europe. And while modern eyes may see this as abuse, the medieval church saw it as order, a divinely sanctioned system to control sin and maintain family structure. Sexuality was dangerous, even between husband and wife. The only safe route was through restriction, regulation, and obedience. The damage ran deep. Women learned to view their own bodies with suspicion. Men were taught that dominance was not only permitted, but required. Intimacy became a duty, not a desire. Affection was censored. Love, if it existed, was buried under layers of fear, confession, and caution. Even when couples loved each other, and surely some did, they had to navigate a web of spiritual landmines. A kiss at the wrong time, a caress on the wrong day, a need that conflicted with a fast. The simplest acts of tenderness could be tinged with guilt. And so the church, with its rules and rituals, not only shaped the altar, it invaded the marriage bed, rewriting the language of desire, pleasure, and even consent. Because in medieval Europe, Being married did not mean you were free. It meant your body and your soul now belonged to the system. She turned away. He pulled her back. She begged for sleep, for time, for tenderness, but none was granted. The priest had said it. Wives, submit to your husbands. Her husband reminded her of that often. And when he came to her, she did not refuse because she could not. This was her role. Her body was his. Her resistance meant sin. This was not passion. This was not love. This was the marital debt. In the canon law of medieval Europe, there existed a simple yet devastating idea. A spouse owed their partner sexual access, always. This obligation, called the marital debt, was not about love or desire. It was a contractual expectation, rooted in scripture and enforced by custom, confession, and church courts. The origins of the concept came from 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul writes, "The husband should fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does." This passage was used, widely and unquestioningly, to build the legal and moral foundation of medieval marriage. The idea was clear. When a man and woman married, they permanently surrendered their right to refuse one another. If the husband wanted his wife, she had to say yes. If the wife wanted her husband, which was seen as far less likely, he was supposed to say yes as well. But these roles were not equally enforced. For women, the expectation was absolute. A wife could not deny her husband intimacy, not during illness, not during grief, not even after childbirth. If she did, she could be accused of violating her vows. The consequences weren't just emotional, they were spiritual. Refusing her husband's advances could be considered a sin, one that had to be confessed and repented. What made this system so insidious was how it was presented as holy duty. Clergy and moral teachers insisted that the marital debt protected against adultery. They taught that men, in particular, were naturally weak, susceptible to temptation. If a wife refused her husband, he might stray. And if he strayed, she would bear the blame. This logic crushed women beneath a double burden. They were expected to be chaste and passive, but also available on demand. Their bodies were not their own. They were marital currency, exchanged each night as part of the unspoken contract. The Church's own legal texts reflected this imbalance. In Gratian's Decretum, a foundational 12th century canon law compilation, the marital debt was codified with chilling clarity. A husband could demand the debt at any time. A wife was forbidden from entering a convent or taking religious vows without her husband's permission, because that would deny him the debt. A spouse who refused the debt could be dragged before a church court. In many cases, only illness or religious abstention, with mutual consent, could excuse refusal. Imagine the lived experience of this rule. A woman, exhausted after hours in the field or kitchen, is approached by her husband. She's sore, grieving, maybe newly postpartum, but he reminds her. The priest said she must submit. The sin would not be his, it would be hers. And so, she lies still, stares at the ceiling, and waits for it to end. This was not considered abuse. It was considered marriage. In noble households, where marriages were often arranged and affection was rare, the marital debt became a cold ritual. Queens and countesses were expected to bear heirs and fast. Refusing intimacy might anger a king, cause a scandal, or even trigger a legal inquiry. In some cases, noble women were sent away, accused of withholding the debt and thereby sabotaging the lineage. Among peasants, the rules were just as harsh. A man could report his wife to the local priest if she refused him. She might be summoned to confession. In some regions, she could be punished publicly, humiliated by the village for failing her role. The same was not true in reverse. If a husband refused his wife due to cruelty, infidelity, or simply disinterest, he was rarely judged. A wife could beg. She could cry. She could try to seduce. But she had no legal recourse. Her body was owed. His was optional. This imbalance was reflected even in confessional manuals, the books priests used to assign penance. A woman who denied her husband without cause might be told to fast or donate to the church. A man who beat his wife for refusing might be warned to be gentler, but rarely punished. If a woman complained that her husband was violent during intimacy, she was told to be more obedient, more humble, more accepting. The logic of the marital debt permeated every aspect of life. It meant that girls, from a young age, were raised to believe that their bodies existed for others, not just to bear children, but to satisfy men's desires, even when those desires hurt them. Some women resisted, in secret or in silence. There are tales of wives who fled to convents, who begged bishops for annulments, who confessed their despair in letters and journals. One 14th-century French woman wrote of her husband demanding the debt. So often she bled in places where there should be no blood. Her priest told her to endure and to pray harder. The church's advice to women was often summed up in a single, devastating word: submission. Even saints were cited as examples. Saint Monica, the mother of Augustine, was praised for enduring her husband's passions in silence. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was celebrated for her obedience, even when her husband's behavior caused her pain. Obedience was not just encouraged, it was canonized. What's most haunting about the marital debt is how it erased the concept of consent. In a modern understanding of relationships, consent is the foundation of intimacy. But in medieval thought, once a woman said yes at the altar, that consent was assumed forever. No matter her health, no matter her fear, no matter her feelings, her no longer counted. This belief has echoes even in more recent times, where legal systems continued to deny the existence of marital rape well into the 20th century. The roots of that injustice lie here, in the doctrine that said wives could not refuse because their bodies were no longer their own. And the damage? It was quiet, hidden, passed from mother to daughter in whispered warnings, felt in bruises, in sleepless nights, in the weight of duty mistaken for love. There were moments of resistance. There were marriages of kindness. Not every husband used this power cruelly, but the system, the laws, the sermons, the expectations was built to enable dominance, not partnership. And the woman? She was told she was holy for enduring, praised for her silence, taught that obedience would earn her grace in heaven, even if it meant suffering on earth. She stood at the edge of the cradle, silent. The room was quiet, but her heart was loud. This was her third loss in 2 years. Around her, no one offered comfort. Her husband did not speak. The midwife folded the blanket without a word. The message was clear, though never said aloud. Her value, her role, her future, all depended on her ability to give life. In medieval Europe, a woman's worth within marriage was often tied to her ability to bear children, particularly sons. This was not simply a matter of family pride. It was connected to land, legacy, and survival. For noble families, fertility was a matter of politics and power. A son could inherit estates, titles, and responsibilities. He would continue the family name and strengthen alliances through future marriages. A daughter had value too, as a bridge to other families, but it was a male heir that secured the line. This pressure meant that noble women, from the moment they married, were expected to conceive quickly and often. Their marriages were watched closely by both families and courts. If a woman did not become pregnant soon after her wedding, questions began to arise. Was something wrong? Was she being faithful? Was she capable? And when sons did not come, or did not survive, the consequences could be harsh. Take Queen Bertha of Holland, for example. She was married to King Philip I of France and gave birth to several children, none of whom were male heirs. Eventually, she was set aside by her husband. Officially, it was said to be for her appearance. But historians agree, it was her failure to produce a son that cost her the throne. Even outside royal courts, the same expectations applied, especially in rural communities. For peasant families, children were not only beloved, they were essential. They worked the fields, tended animals, fetched water, and helped with daily survival. A large family meant help during the harvest and support in old age. But childbirth in the Middle Ages was dangerous. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors in most places, and very few remedies for infection or complications. Women often gave birth at home, helped by a midwife or older female relatives. Even under the best circumstances, every pregnancy carried a significant risk. Yet women were expected to keep going, to bear many children, often back-to-back. Some gave birth to 10 or more over the course of their lives. Many did so while still caring for toddlers, managing a household, or laboring in the fields. If a child died, and many did, due to disease or poor nutrition, the grief was deep. But society did not allow much time to mourn. In many cases, the unspoken expectation was to try again immediately. The church recognized motherhood as sacred and spoke of it with honor. Saints were praised for raising children in faith. Sermons called on women to be strong, patient, and devout. But these ideals often left little room for rest, choice, or personal fulfillment. A woman who struggled to conceive might be blamed, or even feared. Her neighbors might whisper about curses, sin, or hidden wrongdoing. Some women turned to prayer, visiting shrines, or seeking blessings from saints known to protect mothers and infants. Rarely was the husband's fertility questioned. In fact, male infertility was almost never discussed. The burden always fell on the wife. She was expected to carry the hope of the household and the responsibility for any disappointment. And when daughters were born, the reactions were mixed. Yes, girls could bring value to the family, especially through future marriages. But too many daughters and not enough sons could be seen as a burden. Among peasants, families might struggle to save enough for dowries. Among nobles, the pressure to produce a male heir could lead to political consequences, even annulments. Still, it's important to remember love did exist. There were surely mothers who adored their children, regardless of gender. There were fathers who welcomed each new life with gratitude. But the system, the rules, and the expectations, they rarely made space for affection. They focused on outcome, sons, survival, succession. Some women sought relief through religious life. Entering a convent could offer safety, education, and freedom from constant childbirth. But this option was limited, often reserved for noble women or those without marriage prospects. Most women did not have this choice. And even when women longed to be mothers, their health was often overlooked. Conditions like anemia, infection, or long-term exhaustion were common. Many women lived with untreated pain. Some never fully recovered from childbirth. Others passed away young, leaving behind large families and grieving husbands who were encouraged by both custom and necessity to marry again quickly. Pregnancy was not just a hope. It was a duty women were expected to accept without question, regardless of risk, weariness, or sorrow. And if they couldn't, if their bodies said no, if they grew sick or tired or simply did not conceive, then they often lived in silence, their worth quietly diminished, their names faded into the background of a family tree they were expected to grow but could not. This, too, was part of medieval marriage. Not just the vows, not just the wedding feast, but the quiet, daily expectation to bring forth life, no matter the cost. She had followed every rule. She said yes when asked, stood where she was told, bore the children expected of her, and stayed silent through every hardship. But when the pain became too much, when the hurt could no longer be hidden, she asked for help. And the answer was silence. In the medieval world, a wife's suffering was not unusual. It was expected. Throughout this exploration of medieval marriage, one truth has echoed again and again. For many women, there was no way out. From the first moment a girl was betrothed, often in childhood, her life was shaped by duty, obedience, and sacrifice. The system was not built with her protection in mind. It was built to maintain alliances, preserve property, and ensure tradition. And at the center of this system was the church. To be clear, the Church of the Middle Ages was not simply a religious body. It was one of the most powerful institutions in Europe, influencing laws, customs, kings, and commoners. Its teachings defined right and wrong. Its courts settled disputes. Its words were treated as divine truth. And those words, particularly regarding marriage, reinforced a rigid structure. Men led, women followed. In church ceremonies across Europe, brides vowed to obey, while husbands vowed to protect. But protection was often interpreted as authority, and obedience as submission, without question. Even in cases of mistreatment, women were expected to endure. A husband might be harsh, unfaithful, or even violent, yet the church rarely intervened. Violence was seen as a domestic matter, not a spiritual one, unless it became scandalous or life-threatening. There was a concept called moderate correction. This meant a husband had the right to discipline his wife physically if he believed it was necessary, as long as it was not considered excessive. What moderate meant, of course, varied wildly. A woman could be beaten, scolded, or locked away, and still be told to return to her marriage with patience and prayer. Divorce, as we understand it today, did not exist. Marriage was considered a permanent sacrament, breakable only under extremely rare conditions. These included proven infidelity, religious vows, or marriages made under serious deception. Abuse was not grounds for annulment. Emotional suffering, loneliness, or fear were not considered reasons to leave. Some women sought escape through the church itself, entering convents, seeking legal separation, or appealing to bishops. A few found protection, but most did not. Their appeals were dismissed. Their stories were silenced. In places where local tradition held more power than church law, other solutions emerged. In some parts of medieval Germany, there was a rare and strange custom known as divorce by combat. If a couple's conflict was so great that no resolution could be reached, they might be allowed to fight publicly. The man would stand in a pit with one arm tied. The woman would face him with a stone and a cloth or a club. Whoever won the fight could legally end the marriage. Though rare, this custom reveals a deep truth. The system had no clear path for a woman to leave a harmful marriage unless she fought her way out. And that was the tragedy of so many medieval unions. Marriage, in theory, was meant to be a sacred bond, a partnership blessed by faith and community. But in practice, it became a mechanism of control, a contract with unequal terms, a lifelong commitment that demanded much from one side and offered little in return. It's important to note that not every marriage was unhappy. There were couples who found friendship, kindness, and even love. There were husbands who treated their wives with care, wives who were respected, families who thrived. Human compassion existed, always has, always will. But the structure was the problem. It left no room for fairness, consent, or exit. It placed all authority in one hand and asked the other to accept silently. As time moved forward, change came slowly. The late Middle Ages brought new ideas, growing literacy, and increased discussion about individual rights. By the Renaissance and beyond, voices began to challenge the old order. The Reformation, Enlightenment, and modern law would eventually reshape marriage into something more balanced, at least in theory. But the roots of inequality ran deep, and even today, we still feel the echoes. Modern marriage, for many, is based on love, equality, and mutual respect. But the history behind it, the centuries of obedience, control, and silence, should never be forgotten. Because when we remember, we protect. We protect the right to choose, the right to speak, the right to live not just as someone's wife, but as someone's equal. And for all the women who once had no way out, remembering their stories is not just a history lesson. It is an act of justice,